Excellent. Guests, colleagues, students, it's my absolute pleasure to welcome you here today for the inaugural lecture of Professor Julie Hulme. Before we welcome Julie to give a lecture, let me tell you a little bit about her remarkable journey. So Julie is Professor of Psychology Education here at Nottingham Trent University. She was a late arrival to the world of higher education. Her friends and family led perfectly happy and productive lives without going to university, and she left education with science A-level, grades B, E, I understand, and no regrets at the age of 18. Working as a lab technician, that B in biology came in handy, Julie realised that if she didn't go to university, she was always going to be working as somebody else's assistant. So with help from her former biology A-level teacher, she got a place at university. But just weeks before starting, she discovered that she was pregnant with her daughter Megan. And uni plans got put on hold. However, she had made up her mind she was doing this, so she started a foundation year at Keele University and went on to achieve a first-class honours in BSc Biology and Psychology. Julie says the psychology bit was accidental. It was supposed to be biochemistry, but in self-doubt she changed course at the last minute, thinking that psychology might be easier. Tactful. Julie's final year project supervisor, the late Professor Carol Hackney, took her under her wing and gave her the opportunity to study for a PhD in neuroscience at Keele. Alongside lots of part-time teaching jobs, Julie achieved her doctorate and her university teaching qualification in 2003. During this period, Julie says she was inspired by two fabulous colleagues. Are they here today? They're not here today. Professor Jim Hartley and Dr. Peter Shevins, both innovative teachers, wise mentors, and scholars of learning and teaching at Keele. However, Julie says that at this point, she couldn't face another day working alone in a dark microscope lab. The biology love affair had run its course. Serendipitously, the head of the psychology department at Keele, is he here today? No? I keep trying to do a shout. Professor John Sloboda, he was looking to recruit a teaching fellow. Julie applied and set off in a new direction as an accidental psychologist. She became fascinated with learning and teaching, partly from her own experiences of feeling like she never quite fitted in as a student, and also from seeing lots of bright, so-called non-traditional students struggling at uni. She refocused on psychology in higher education, and in 2014 she moved to the Higher Education Academy as the discipline lead for psychology. And as discipline lead for psychology, Julie was a one-woman support network for all the psychology departments in the UK. So she got good at consultancy, organising events and writing on trains. She also honed her leadership and coaching skills and developed a national reputation for her work in psychology education. Julie says that she was beginning to wonder if she might actually succeed at this psychology academic business. And so she decided to return to Keele Psychology, firstly under Professor Michael Murray, and then alongside Professor Jim Grange. And she became a reader in psychology and director of education. In 2016, Julie was awarded a National Teaching Fellowship. In 2019, she became the Deputy Chair of the Association of National Teaching Fellows. And in 2022, she joined us at NTU in psychology as our first Professor of Psychology Education. Here, Julie is helping us to develop our community of teaching and scholarship academics right across the institution. She's also continuing to publish in psychology education, inclusive teaching, and what it means to be an education-focused academic. Outside of all this, Julie says she enjoys travelling the world with her husband Callum. She is grandma to Nathaniel, 11, who is here today, and Poppy, 4, and Leo, 1, and she says she believes that grandchildren are a wonderful compensation for having to raise teenagers. So she says, thanks Megan and Alex, who couldn't be here today. Julie says she doesn't know what she wants to be when she grows up, but she thinks she might give this education-focused psychology academic business a go for a bit longer at least. She is immensely accomplished. She is immensely modest. So without further ado, please give a really warm welcome to Professor Julie Hulme to give this evening's inaugural lecture, Giving Psychology Away, Making a Difference in Higher Education.
Thank you so much, Jane, for that lovely welcome. And I'm really genuinely very proud and pleased to be here tonight. Jane just listed some of my accomplishments, and I think one of my proudest moments was getting a job here. So there you go, shout out NTU. So I'm going to be talking about giving psychology away, and you'll see later in the talk that this is a quote from a historical figure in psychology. I'm not going to give it away too early. I'll save giving psychology away till a bit later. But my whole career, I think, has been really about making a difference and trying to improve higher education for other people, for my students and for my colleagues. So that's going to be the focus of tonight's talk. An inaugural lecture is always a slightly strange animal because you never quite know who's going to be here. It's a public lecture, so there could be all sorts of people, from grandchildren through to Pro-Vice Chancellors for education, and somehow you have to tell a story that brings in the personal elements of that career journey, but also brings in the professional story as well. So I'm going to try and juggle that a little bit. There's lots of room for embarrassing photos and for possible humiliation. But I should also warn you, I have a habit of going off at a tangent when I tell stories. This has actually been captured in The Psychologist magazine. This was reported once by John Sutton, the editor, that Julie sometimes starts to tell stories and doesn't get to the end of them. So if that happens, I'm hoping there might be a little bit of time at the end for some questions. And you can ask me, what was that about? Barn owls, which was John Sutton's question. Okay, so I'm going to start at the very beginning. And you'll see here, I actually can't see what you can see, so I'm going to, whoa, disaster. There we go. I'm going to move over here, I'm going to reassemble the microphone. I knew this was a bad idea, there we go. So you have at the top left a very bad photo of me, because it's a photo of a photo, because of course I'm old enough that there weren't digital photos. So, there we go, is that working? Yeah, cool. So the curly hair was a thing right from the beginning. My dad always used to tell the nursery rhyme, there was a little girl who had a little curl. But from the age of 4, the first photo at the bottom there is my first ever school photo. And it's a rather gloomy Julie, not because I didn't like school, although I didn't later, but because I've just had an operation on my right buttock. So I was sitting on a rubber ring, very uncomfortable, having had a boil announced. But you'll notice that from the age of 4, my hair was flat, because my mum would brush it down to not allow the curls because they just got messy. In the middle we have my mum and dad, who sadly are no longer with us. Mum was a childminder and dad was first in the RAF during World War II, and then worked as an electrician, and then in later life as an electrical sales rep. So he and Mum were huge caravan fanatics and used to spend lots of time with me as a small child, imprisoning me in said caravan. It's a very small space to take a small child. So yeah, I stopped travelling with them when I was about 13 and looked forward to later travelling the world as an adult independently, rather than in small boxes on wheels. And then in the top right, that's myself with my two technically half-sisters, but although we never lived together, definitely sisters. One of them's here tonight, Mal, and this was at my niece's wedding, and Jill is my other sister. And the last one of the bunch is my brother Ian, big brother. Again, sadly no longer with us, but I feel that, I wondered about putting this photo in. The speech bubble says, "Dreaming's free, but only until the Tories find a way to privatise it." He very much influenced me politically. He was the first feminist that I ever met, and he was an absolute social justice aficionado. He really championed people who were disadvantaged, and particularly he was a trade union rep, so a real big influence early in my life. So those are the people who made me who I am, and you can hold them responsible later, because at least one of them's here. I went to school in Kidsgrove in North Staffordshire, to Mary Hill Comprehensive. These are photos that I've snaffled off the internet, so they're not particularly necessarily at the right time of history. But this is what they look like. So Mary Hill Comprehensive on the left there, quite a big state comprehensive school. I believe about 3 of us went to university from a year of about 200 kids. So it wasn't a big, university accessing school. Most of us lived in a miner's estate around the school, so it was a big council estate. And university wasn't really a thing. I then went on to Newcastle College. The only photo I can find of Newcastle College that isn't how it looks now, which is architecturally transformed, is one that was taken through somebody's car window in the rain. So, but Newcastle College was a good place for me, because I got to meet slightly different types of people and to really kind of come into my own as a student. But sadly, I applied to university and didn't get in. So this was the point at which I said, oh, why am I bothering? And gave up. So the B and 2 E's in my science A-levels was the result of kind of going, well, there's a snooker club and there's bars down the road. And why would I need an education anyway? So instead of carrying on to university, I went to work at the Patterson Institute for Cancer Research, which is part of Christie Hospital in Manchester, and worked as an assistant scientific officer, so a science technician basically in a lab, doing tissue culture, looking at breast cancer growth and skin cancer growth, culturing cells in sterile conditions and looking at what made them grow and what stopped them growing and whether we could use that as a way of treating cancer. While I was there, that was when I started to realise actually, maybe I don't want to be just doing what everybody else tells me and following instructions all the time. So they decided that they could send me off to do a HNC at Stockport College. So that's the bottom picture here. Stockport College, where I was a part-time student on day release for about 3 months doing biochemistry. This is where the belief that biochemistry was going to be really hard came from, and I really didn't last very long. It was really hard trying to do it on sort of half days here and evenings there. It's a really difficult way to study. Anybody here who's managed to get your qualifications while working part-time, it's a tough way to go, so hats off to you. So then, as Jane said, I applied and got a place at the University of Hull, and then just a few weeks before I arrived at the University of Hull, along came wee baby Megan. So I think she's about maybe a week, 2 weeks old there. She's not very old, not really tiny. The fashion choices, obviously, interesting. That was my favourite shirt at the time. So Megan arrived, and I managed to get myself a place at Keele University. And I got myself into their foundation year. They did actually say I could start the main degree course, I could go straight into first year. But I was so underconfident after taking time out and working and getting 2 E's and all of that. So I kind of figured foundation year would be a good place to start. So I went to Keele, This is the beautiful bit of Keele. There are some very beautiful bits of Keele. It has a lovely campus. And while I was there, I met these troublesome folk up in the top right corner. The one on the left is now my husband, Callum. We met pretty much the first week of foundation year, I think. And his best friend, Ashley. And I finally got there with my biology and psychology degree. I graduated, first class honours, and that's me and Megan at graduation. Or, as she called it, funny hat day. It was definitely a silly hat, wasn't it, Megan? So, my final year project, I actually got to do 2 final year projects. One was in biology and one in psychology. And I loved both of them. The psychology one was all about bullying in primary school children. So I worked with a local primary school and did lots of work interviewing very small children about their experiences of friendship quality and their experiences of bullying, and looked at how friendship could be protective against bullying, but also the detrimental effects of being isolated within a primary school and not having that social support and that friendship. Biology, I decided to do something a little bit different. And so I signed up to do a project on barn owl conservation, and I spent most of a year, including the summer before my final year actually started, running around farms, catching small mammals in traps to see how many there were and whether there was enough to sustain a barn owl population, and then releasing barn owl chicks into the wild and looking at how well they succeeded. So a really interesting project. Not something that I ever really intended to carry on, but my PhD supervisor and my final year project supervisor here, Carol Hackney, said that she thought that she could see something worth nurturing. And so she took me under her wing and she decided that she wanted me to come and do a PhD with her. And she was a very strong-minded individual, a very assertive person, but genuinely quite lovely. And so she had a small amount of funding for a charity called Defeating Deafness, used to be the Hearing Research Trust, and she gave me a part-funded PhD to study glutamate handling in the mammalian organ of Corti. So this is your organ of Corti. It's a snail shell-like structure that is found in the hardest bone in your body. So if you feel behind your ear, you've got a really hard bone called your temporal bone, and your cochlea, your mammalian cochlea, because you're humans, you're mammals, lives in behind that hard bone. And that snail cell structure has little hair cells, little cells that have little hairs that stick out the top and wiggle around when you hear a sound. And they talk to the cochlear nerve, the auditory nerve that runs back to your brain and tells you about what you're hearing. Now, the really exciting thing about this, apparently, is that there are 2 types of hair cells in your organ of Corti, inner hair cells and outer hair cells. And everybody knew that the inner hair cells were the ones that moved when you heard a sound, and that they were the ones transmitting messages about that sound to your brain. They didn't know what the outer hair cells were doing. And so my PhD was really the first piece of work to show that outer hair cells were actively involved in hearing. And what they were doing was modulating the sound and helping to make it more accurate in how we hear. So that was my PhD. It took 7 years. It was part-time, and that was because I was doing so much teaching. So basically, by the end of my PhD, I was teaching full-time at Keele. I had been teaching part-time at Stoke-on-Trent College. I'd been teaching part-time at Manchester Met. I carried on teaching part-time at the Open University alongside the full-time job at Keele and the PhD. I'm missing somewhere. Never mind. I had multiple teaching jobs at any one time. And what I realised was that while sitting in dark rooms looking down microscopes was perhaps not doing my mental health the most good, because being in a dark room on your own is probably not the best way to promote well-being. I loved my teaching. I really genuinely loved my teaching. And working in FE, I was teaching psychology students, biology students, policing students, health and social care students. There was a lot of teaching. Teaching those students made me realise how many of them had the same concerns that I'd had coming into my degree. That maybe I'm not good enough, maybe I'm not clever enough, maybe I've not got this, maybe I don't know the rules of this particular university game. And I started to realise that actually there was things we could do about that. And so when John Sloboda advertised the teaching fellowship in psychology at Keele and invited me to apply, this seemed like a perfect opportunity to build a career around my teaching. And in that, I'd already met Pete Shevins, who's the photo on the left there. He's now retired. He was teaching what he called experimental teaching in biology at Keele, and I'd been doing some teaching with him as a lab demonstrator for him. And suddenly he had a heart attack, and he rang me from his hospital bed and said, "Julie, don't worry, but I'm really ill. I'm in hospital, I've had a heart attack. Will you do some teaching for me?" "Yes, Pete, of course, but you don't need to be organising this, you know, have a chat to the head of department, he'll sort it out, don't worry." No. You see, I've got this second year module on animal physiology that's experimental, and I don't know anybody else that can teach it. You need to teach it. And I've got a third year module on biological basis of behaviour, and it's biology and psychology mixed together. Who else is going to teach that? Come on. And I'm like, "Yeah, but Pete, you know, you're not well. You don't know. I'm going to send you all the stuff. I need you to do it." So I took that on. Now, Pete's experimental teaching, the animal physiology module, was quite radical for its time. We're talking about around about probably 2001. And he was not teaching. So he was getting his uni students to come in and take tests, and then to study for the tests outside. And he was giving them reading, and he was giving them all sorts of things to do. So this was a whole new model. Usually, university teaching was like this. People stood at the front and bored everybody and talked a lot. And he was doing something completely different. And that really intrigued me. And then teaching that for him helped me to realise what we can do by giving students agency and control over their own learning. So that was quite eye-opening. And then Jim Hartley here, receiving his Psychology Education Award from Doc Meal, who was the president of the BPS at the time, he taught me as an undergrad, he mentored me in psychology when I took on the teaching fellowship, but he was getting students in second year to write their own textbook. Like, wow, you can do really exciting things in teaching. And I didn't know all this, and you don't have to stand at the front and bore everybody. You can get students doing the exciting stuff. And so they would publish their book for the next year's students, and then the next year's students would come and they'd write the book for the next year. I've still got my textbook from that module. So he was talking to me about all these things, about how can we make learning and teaching better. And part of my job at Keele for this teaching fellowship was working as a learning support tutor specific to psychology. So all of the psychology students, they've got a bit of a problem with student withdrawal in the first year. I was recruited specifically to try and prevent that problem, and put on lots of workshops, wrote handouts, did all sorts of things to try and support, and did lots of one-to-one support with these students. And the thing that I realised was actually, where students lacked confidence, often it was because nobody had taught them the skills. So I had a leaflet rack, because we're still going back that far in history, a leaflet rack outside my office, where I used to put all these study skills handouts. Alex, you might remember this. Jim came past one day and picked up some of my handouts, and came back a couple of days later. He said, "Julie, that critical evaluation handout you've written, students don't know what critical evaluation is. We don't tell them, you know, we need to tell them more." I'd written a handout to explain what it was. He said, "That critical evaluation handout, I had a read of it, it's really good." I was like, "Oh, cheers, Jim." He said, so I rang up a friend who's an editor of a magazine called Psychology Review, which is an A-level student magazine, and She says she'll give you 150 quid to publish it. And I was like, oh, I didn't know you could do that. So there was something about this time, about learning about how teaching could be innovative, could be stretching, could be different, you could change things, and you could publish stuff, and it didn't just have to be research about guinea pigs and hair cells. And then the last picture here on the slide is a piece of work that I did with Stephen Bostock, who later became a National Teaching Fellow himself, looking at communicubes. And communicubes are, you can see, six-sided cubes, and the students could vote with them. So you could quiz them, you could ask them, do you want me to go over that again? And they could show you a particular colour on the cube as to what they wanted to happen next, and they could make choices and make decisions. So it was kind of like clickers. If anybody remembers clickers, you could, multiple choice, A, B, C, D, but you had to carry all the clickers in. And then they broke, and then they didn't work, and it didn't, This was really easy. The cubes folded flat, so you could just put them together as a cube, and they could show what they thought. Really handy. So that was another example of what I called at the time experimental teaching. But then I started to get a bit more clever and think, well, psychology, this is about human behaviour, it's about how people think, how they learn, all of those sorts of things. Surely, learning and teaching comes down to psychology. So maybe I could start applying psychology to thinking about learning and teaching. And at this point, I moved to Staffordshire University, and the first thing that I started thinking about was students' feedback on assessments. So students would hand in a piece of work, and the lecturers would, at that point mostly, handwrite their feedback on the work. And all of the students said, my feedback's rubbish. I can't learn from this, I don't get anything meaningful from it, I don't understand what they're looking for, I can't transfer it to the next piece of learning, it's no use to me. My colleagues were saying, I spend hours writing feedback, I sweat blood and tears over my feedback, this is an absolute nightmare, and then they don't read it, and there's a big pile of essays sat in the office that nobody's collected. I'm like, this is communication, this is two-way communication. This is students receiving some information, colleagues sending some information, and the information somehow is getting lost along the way. So, set up a project funded by the Higher Education Academy, the HEA. We got about £10,000 worth of funding back in 2008, 2009, and did a piece of work around assessment of feedback, looking at what would students find useful, and what did staff find difficult, and how could we support that? So we came up with a whole system of gathering and delivering feedback that worked for students. It bit me on the bum a few years later when I went back to Keele, because the psychology department was actually using one of my initiatives, which was to produce an assessment feedback sheet, where the students actually told you what they wanted feedback on. And so I then got a big pile of marking and had to focus on the things the students had told me that they wanted to know about, which was great, but did add some work. So that was with Dr. Mark Forshaw, who is now Professor Mark Forshaw at Edge Hill University. And he was the person who introduced me to qualitative psychology methods. Up until this point, I was a neuroscientist. I did stats. I did things about brains and biology. And Mark taught me that actually understanding how we use talk and text is really important in understanding particularly how students learn. So Mark's a health psychologist, and he was looking at how do we change behaviour to help people to be more healthy. I was looking at how do we change behaviour to help students to learn. So he taught me how to do qualitative analysis. And then I set up a new course, the MSc Teaching Psychology for A-level psychology teachers who wanted to progress in their careers and take on leadership positions. They needed a master's. It was the first course of its type. It was a distance learning course. And the lovely Sarah Alcock was a student on this course, and she got really cross about the fact that Ofsted wanted everybody to teach according to learning styles. And who's a visual learner in the audience? Who's an auditory learner? Who's a kinesthetic learner? There's a few hands gone up. The evidence suggests that learning styles are not actually a thing. We think they're a thing, but they're not a thing. And we teach students in schools. Have you learned about learning styles, Nathaniel? You been taught about them? No? Good. If anyone teaches you about learning styles, tell them, my grandma says it's a load of rubbish. Yeah? Learning styles are not a thing. And actually this paper suggests that teaching to learning styles is a really useless idea, and that there's lots of other things we could be doing instead, like getting students to translate their ideas into different modes of thinking that will help them to elaboratively process, think deeply about what they're learning. And all of that led to a Staffordshire University Teaching Excellence Award. However, Julies don't stand still for very long, and so soon I was dashing off to go and work for the Higher Education Academy. I've done quite a lot of work with the Higher Education Academy Psychology Network, and in 2010 went to a retreat at Chichley Hall, where we talked about the future of undergraduate psychology in the United Kingdom. And the photo here, it's not very clear, but I'm somewhere, yeah, I'm there, that's me. In the snow at Chichley Hall, being kept awake at night by George the Peacock. And we looked at this idea of what was going to happen to psychology in the next 5 years. So this report was published in 2011. And at this retreat, I met the wonderful Jackie Cranny, who has not so long ago retired. She's at the University of New South Wales, but she was an incredible inspiration to me. And she talked about this idea of psychological literacy. The idea that we could see psychology as like something of a toolkit where the things we learned, like about how people think, how people interact socially, how we can change behaviour, we could use that in our everyday lives, in our personal lives, in our work, and in our society. And in 2012, she and Daragh McDermott published this book, The Psychologically Literate Citizen, and I rushed out to buy it and started working at the HEA and read it on huge numbers of trains and carried it with me everywhere, being totally blown away by this new concept, because psychology had very much been taught as, here's a psychological theory, here's how we do research in psychology, go and learn it, get an exam, out you come the other side. And this whole way of thinking about psychology was about saying, no, what we want to do is to teach students to problem solve with psychology. So we need to be telling them that we need them to solve problems, and then we need to teach them to solve problems, and then we need to assess them solving problems. And so by 2014, well, in 2012, Jackie Cranny wrote a new definition for psychological literacy, which you can see there, the ability to apply psychology to meet personal, professional and societal needs. And by 2014, I'd got so addicted to this topic that I was the UK expert on psychological literacy and was invited to be part of the QAA Subject Benchmark Statement working group to inform what the curriculum would look like in psychology across the whole of the UK. And that was really exciting. It was the first time that psychological literacy was mentioned in any official documentation about psychology. So I felt that was a real achievement. But there were still lots of people going, well, I don't know what it is. What is it? Darragh's laughing because he was one of them, reading this and going, psychological literacy? No. So at the Higher Education Academy, working there as the discipline lead, whilst travelling on lots of trains, because if you're working with 108 different psychology departments, then you do have to travel a lot to go and see them all. I wrote and collaborated with some amazing people on these guides. So we wrote an employability and psychology guide for departments, an introductory guide to psychological literacy and psychologically literate citizen. Darragh's now wishing he found it. And also started to think about transition. So the idea that students are coming into universities, and staff often think that students come and they're not well prepared. And that was kind of a project where we started to find out, well, what are they not prepared in? And academic staff were talking about things like, it was across all of the STEM disciplines, so science, technology, engineering and maths. And people were talking about, students don't know how to think critically. Students don't know how to read research papers. Students don't know how to think like a psychologist, or think like an astronomer, or think like an engineer. And I was like, well, they're A-level students, or equivalent. Why would they be able to do all those things, and why aren't we teaching them? But it was very much a kind of discourse in the sector that's still there now, that it's something wrong with the students, or it's something wrong with the way that they're taught at A-level. And we came up with this idea of blame the midwife, because the A-level teachers would say, well, I taught them really well, and then they came to university and they'd obviously forgotten it all. But actually, they came to me from GCSE and they didn't know anything then either. And the GCSE teacher would say, yeah, but when they come from primary school, they're in a terrible state. And so, eventually it has to be the midwife's fault, right? Meanwhile, back to the personal story. In 2013, Callum, who I'd met in my first week at Keele, we've been very good friends for a very long time. We finally decided that actually we'd known each other long enough, we might try this marriage idea. And we got married at Keele Hall. And you can see there, some of the people in the audience tonight, you can see yourselves. So Becky and Mal and, Callum and I were there, and Alex, who was also a photographer, very cleverly managed to get into her own photograph. And this over on the far left is Alex, my stepson, who can't be here tonight. And also in 2013, this little munchkin arrived, Nathaniel, being very cute and an absolutely joyous addition to the family. So, I carried on thinking about transitions. There was lots of personal transitions going on with getting married and having grandchildren and things, but also thinking about transitions in universities. And so I worked a lot with the beautiful Helen Kitching, who sadly passed away just a few weeks ago. If you recognise that photo, you might have seen it in The Psychologist. I wrote her obituary. So we worked together a lot around transitions, and particularly looking at psychology education. And this was when I was the vice chair teaching of the BPS Division of Academics, Researchers and Teachers in Psychology, and we commissioned a review, which Helen and I worked on together. At the same time, Andy Hulme, who was also on that division of the BPS, and I started working around transition and adaptability, so thinking about grit, resilience, and how do we build that. And actually, what we came up with and decided in this paper was that actually that's not something about us as individuals. It's something that, yes, we can build our resilience, we can build our adaptability and our ability to cope with change, but it's a feature that comes with social support. So again, this idea of social support started to be really important to thinking about how we cope with transitions and change. And then Naomi Winston, another National Teaching Fellow, absolutely fabulous individual, we worked together quite a lot. She and I wrote a paper, well, I've got a chapter, Duck to Water or Fish Out of Water, and basically said, there's a whole discourse around going to university that everybody says it's really hard. It's a big challenge, it's difficult to go to university. Some students take to it like a fish to water, no, a duck to water. I'm getting the metaphors mixed up. Some students don't have a problem, and we need to stop problematizing it just because it's a transition. We need to think about what can help students to make that transition successfully. So that's what we started to think about, and we looked at the fact that actually students were not really knowing what to expect when they went to university. So they would think that, for example, they had a 100% attendance record at school, they'd be able to attend university. They'd forgotten to factor in the fact that their 9 o'clock lecture on Thursday was after the Students' Union night on a Wednesday, and that mum wasn't there to shake them awake and kick them out the door. But they thought that they'd find some things really difficult that they found quite easy because they were quite capable of learning. And so we started to think about how students tell stories to each other that can support them within their educational transitions, and how that social support is one of the most important things that students can get. 2017 17 and Stacey Lyons walks into my office with her guide dog and says, "Julie, will you supervise my final year project about disabled student experience?" "Yeah, of course I will." "Oh," she says, "everybody else said no." Well, A, why wasn't I your first choice? But okay, what's going on? And she said, "Well, disabled students have a tough time at uni. They often can't access learning in the same way that other students can, and staff can be quite frightened of working with us." Hence the fact that loads of people said no, they didn't want to supervise her project. So we started to work together on a project about accessibility and disabled student experience. She was fabulous. She graduated Keele with a first-class degree in psychology and education. She went to Oxford to do an MSc in educational research methods, and then she said, "No, that's not good enough, I'm going back to Keele, I'm working with Julie." Came to do a PhD with me at Keele, which was amazing. So she's currently on a leave of absence from study. She's taking a study leave. But we did write this article for Wonky about students being locked out of their education and not being able to access things. And then along came Pippa Hamilton. And Pippa was a student with chronic illness. She has ME. And she'd been told she'd never be able to go to university because of her illness. And we worked together studying the experiences of students with chronic illness in higher education. And so this was another student publication, 2023, with Pippa. And one of the things that we found in her work was that students find staff either to be police or allies. They're either enforcing regulations and rules and not taking into account disabilities, or they're moving heaven and earth to make sure that students are supported and appropriately given access to learning. Pippa went on to do an MSc with me, and we're in the process of writing up that paper as well, so watch this space. But again, this idea of social support being a huge part of student experience was coming through really strongly. At the same time, the fabulous Alexandra Kent up there, also in the audience, was running a module at Keele, which was social psychology in the workplace. And we changed it collaboratively to become Making a Difference with Psychology. So that's where the Making a Difference bit of my title comes from, because it was all about solving real-world problems with students and working collaboratively together. We've moved on a bit, and Phil Banyard, who's also in the audience tonight, a very pleasant surprise, used to be head of department here in psychology at NTU, got in touch with me and said, "I'm writing this paper about giving psychology away. And I think you've done quite a bit of work on psychological literacy. Do you want to join up?" Yes, of course I want to work with Phil Banyard. Who doesn't want to work with Phil Banyard? And so we worked on this paper called Giving Psychology Away, How George Miller's Vision is Being Realised by Psychological Literacy. Now, George Miller was the president of the Association of the American Psychological Association in 1969, and he gave a speech that said, basically, we've messed up our world, and humans are the people who've made the mess. You know, it's not the elephants or the gorillas, it's us. We've made a mess of this world, and the way we can solve it is to use psychology. We need to give psychology away. So we need to stop thinking of ourselves as experts in psychology and give it to the people who need it. So if we want to change, global warming, if we want to change pollution, if we want to change terrorism and war, we need to give people psychology. And this was a new idea to me, but I rather liked it. And Phil and I reflected on the fact that actually social influencers are out there promoting their own version of sort of popular psychology, telling people a story about psychology. That's not very true. But we as psychologists are sitting in our offices writing journal articles that the public doesn't read. How do we get this true message about psychology and its value out to the rest of the world? We need to give psychology away. And so I realised that I had been doing this, but without really knowing it, and then decided I'd do it on purpose. And so this is a few things that I did on purpose to try and give psychology away. So CBBC News Round up in the top left, that was terrifying. It was all about why do we like being scared at Halloween at Alton Towers. I have a spider phobia, so that photo's horrendous. I read a policy piece of work from the BPS about mental health and education, and that was an interview that I did for the Times Education Supplement about how we support mental health of children in schools. I wrote my own blog article. I wrote for Callum's magazine, Dart's World, about how to look after your mental health in the pandemic. More for Psychology Review for A-level psychology students about what happens when you're learning something that's sensitive. So if you're learning about attachment theory, how you bond to your parents and you grew up in care, how do you receive that and how do you cope with that in the classroom? Worked with the BPS on transitions, giving advice to students in any subject on how to move into university, and they turned that into a little computer game animation. And I'm now on the steering group for Student Space, which is a mental health support organisation website for students that's run by a student managed charity. No, we're not doing that. At the same time, I realised that I was quite an unusual animal as an education-focused academic. So my focus was around how do we make teaching and learning and student support better? How do we look after student mental health? How do we support disabled students? Big thread of social justice running through everything that I was doing, really. And at the same time, realising that being promoted for learning and teaching is something that's really hard. Because to get to be a professor, you have to kind of get out in the world. You have to be seen nationally, internationally. And if you're teaching, you're in your classroom with your students, having a lovely time, but nobody gets to know what you're doing or who you're doing it with. So how do you build that profile when your focus is teaching and learning? So I set up a group. I was part of the Principal Fellows Network and the National Teaching Fellows Network, and everybody was moaning that we can't get promoted and we've got all this recognition and we've done all these important things, but we can't get rewarded by our university. Fighting with my microphone again. And rather than moping about it, I decided it was time to do something about it. So I set up a network called Professors in Preparation with Debbie Locke. And the logo over on the left, Debbie produced it. It's meant to show, it does show, two education-focused academics trying to climb a ladder, but they're not waiting for one to get to the top and then pull the other up, because there's not many professors in teaching and scholarship in learning and teaching, and so if you wait to find one, you're going to be waiting a long time. So what we needed to do was to peer support each other. And we set this network up to provide peer mentoring and workshops. There are loads of workshops all around everywhere on how to get promoted and what you could do. And started to write about the idea that education-focused academics are experts in higher education. And if you want to make education better, don't go to somebody who researches cognitive psychology, biomedical science, maths, physics. They're wonderful people, but education's not their thing. It's my thing, and it's my colleagues' thing, who do these teaching-focused roles. And so thinking of us as experts, and also as positive disruptors. And this is a bit of a catchphrase of mine now. I first wrote about it in this book chapter. But the idea that if I'm not making changes to the place that I work, I'm probably not doing my job right. I need to be bringing about positive change for students and for colleagues. And so this took me into thinking about the concept of scholarship and the idea that what we needed to do was, yes, do this experimental teaching that I discovered at Keele, but also generally to write about and to talk about and to actively role model and do things that enhance higher education, that make universities better places to study and to work. That we go public with what we're doing and we share it so that people can see what works and what doesn't work. That we let other people criticise our work and we make it better. and that we give it away so that other people can put it into good use. So the work that I do around learning and teaching, I hope has a positive influence here at NTU, in psychology and across the university, but I also give all that away to people in other institutions. And I've come up with my own model of scholarship, the bog-off model, because it's Julie. Not everybody reads journal articles. Some people like to read a nice, easy blog that's less than 1,000 words long and that everybody can read and it's easy. So the buy one, get one free model of scholarship. The idea that you can take what you're doing in your learning and teaching or in your management of education and turn it into an output that people will read and can make a difference. Meanwhile, Callum got really poorly and thankfully was very well looked after by Mr. George, who's now Professor George, bless him, and my niece, Becky, who is also, or was also, a clinical pain specialist nurse at the hospital in Stoke. So he did get better, which was good. Nathaniel was growing up and getting immensely tall. I'm going to zoos and looking at penguins. And Poppy and Leo arrived. And it's around the same time as all this was happening, Nottingham Trent advertised a job for a professor in psychology education. And I thought, I can't do that. I've got a poorly husband, I've got grandchildren, the world is happening around me, how can I do that? Said poorly husband said, come on, you know that job's for you. Maybe not the best timing. Anyway, I went for it, and every time I came, and every interview that I came to, there were 3. The last one was with the Vice Chancellor. And Jane, actually, you were there as well. And various other very grown-up people. I fell a little bit more in love with the university and felt a little bit more like this was where I might belong. And so I came here, and I carried on working on psychological literacy, and working with the BPS. So this is my textbook that came out just a few weeks ago. Psychology in Everyday Life. So it's a textbook for students to talk about how they can use psychology in their personal lives, in their work, and in the communities around them. And in 2022, because I've had more time to write since I've been here than I've probably had in my entire career, wrote an international provocation. I am officially a provocateur. In Frontiers in Education with Jackie Cranny, Dana Dunn, who wrote that book that I carried around with me on trains for a very long time, and various other very important psychology education people around the world, saying, yet again, why is it that we're still not managing to give psychology away? Why is psychology that unwanted bath set that you put in the cupboard and re-give to somebody next year? You know, why don't people want psychology? Why won't they accept it from us? And so this time we actually said, well, what we need to do is get a global group of psychology educators together and make some suggestions about how to improve psychology education so that people actually want it. So this was the International Collaboration on Undergraduate Psychology Outcomes. We've come up with a whole set of different skills and competencies that psychology students can acquire through studying psychology. Massive group of us, there's actually 41 different people, no, 41 different countries represented, including people from underrepresented parts of the world, so Maori psychologists, Aboriginal psychologists, Indigenous South African and Cameroonian psychologists involved in this project. We've redefined psychological literacy, which for me is a bit of a fangirl, was a bit of a whoa moment. I've rewritten the definition. And I'm continuing, I hope, to make a difference in higher education. So I'm writing about cultural responsiveness. How do we manage to communicate across different cultures, and what do we learn when we do that? Again, working with people from non-Western cultures. Continuing to work on autism and the experiences of autistic students in universities. Chronic illness with Pippa. Thinking about why we innovate. Why do we do experimental teaching? Why do we innovate? Why do we change our teaching? And why don't we? What is it about higher education that facilitates that innovation or stops it? and writing 2 chapters in the International Handbook of Learning and Teaching in Psychology, which have just been accepted, on psychological literacy. So, working with people here at NTU, Rose Gann, and Jane McNeil, and Ricky G. Don't know if you'll hear Ricky. There he is. New collaborations looking at education-focused staff, how we progress in our careers. This is a new Advanced HE case study that we've just recently had published. And thinking about what we mean by scholarship and how we can support it in different university contexts. So that's all very exciting. And I'm really looking forward to whatever happens next. There will be more holidays and global travel, I hope. There's a lot of people that I probably haven't remembered to thank. There were some all the way through the presentation. There's some more pictures here. Colleagues, past and present, and lots of family and lots of friends. I can't mention everybody. I knew I'd forget people. So a big thank you to everybody who's made a difference to me. Thank you.
Good evening, colleagues, guests, friends, students. My name is Daragh. My name is Daragh McDermott, and I am the Executive Dean of the School of Social Sciences, and it is a real privilege to be here this evening. I was reflecting in preparation for tonight about one of the first times that I actually met Julie, and it was when Julie contacted, or when we had a conversation about the psychology professorial role here at NTU. And when I came to NTU, we had, one of the reasons why I came to this department was because of the innovations in teaching and learning, because of what it was doing. And wanting to really get under the skin of that and celebrate that. And when I came here, I had the flexibility of trying to decide how to appoint certain professorial roles. And I asked the question, can I appoint a professor on the education pathway? And a lot of people looked at me a little bit musedly, kind of going, don't know, we haven't really done that before. And I said, well, let's give it a shot. And one of the ways that I did that was thinking about, well, who is somebody who has helped set the scene for the sector? Who is somebody who, going back to Advanced HE, and I remember all of those documents, being a head of department at the time, trying to understand how to adapt a psychology curriculum. Thinking about some of those constructions, and said, well, if in an ideal world, somebody like Julie Hulme might be somebody who would apply for this job. So designed a job, put it out to market, and was just absolutely thrilled when contact was made from Julie, and we had some of that initial conversation. And then the impact that you've had while you've been here at NTU, helping to really develop scholarship across the department, but importantly develop a scholarship across the school and the university. It's an incredibly difficult and daunting thing to pull together an inaugural lecture, but I think we can all agree that Julie has summarised a career so far well spent, and one with many more things to do along the way. And to do so to a diverse audience, with a wide age range. Nathaniel, I hope you enjoyed hearing your grandma talk about what she does. And hopefully it's maybe inspired you to think about university one day. Probably not. I mean, fair enough. Yeah. So, sorry, I'm kind of looking at my notes going, what's next? What I'm here to do is to offer that vote of thanks. To thank you to Julie for that really engaging inaugural lecture. Thank you for the contributions that you make to the school, to the department, and to the university. And we really do look forward to continuing to work with you as you develop your work and you develop colleagues' works here at NTU and across the sector. Julie would again like to extend a huge thanks to the many friends, family, colleagues who have joined us here today, and many who were unable to be with us as well. There's a theme of Alex's So a number of Alexes. Julie told me that at her wedding, a quarter of her guests were called Alex. There were only 13 people at the wedding, but that's still a pretty impressive statistic. I'd now like to invite you all for some refreshments, for some opportunity for further discussions, and to continue these fantastic conversations and to celebrate with Julie. But before that, please join me in one final rapturous round of applause for Professor Julie Hulme.
Thank you, everyone. Let's go grab a drink.